Hi witches, witchlings. Welcome back to my channel. Today is another So You Want To video, and today we are talking about working with deities. I have a list for this one because I have to. There's a lot of topics. So I want to start with a few things. I think the main thing I want to get across with this is, do you need to work with deities? No, you do not. In order to be a witch, you do not. You could, I'm like surrounded by the animals. If you want to, I work with a deity, and I don't necessarily identify as pagan, and deity work and worship happens in a bunch of different religions, so it doesn't necessarily make you a pagan. But I am approaching it, I guess, from a more pagan point of view, if that makes sense, a more kind of polytheistic point of view as well. So also, it's a long list. It's gonna be a big video. This is going to go through the way that I would suggest approaching deity work, but also, once again, it's not my business how you practice. There are a few things that I'm going to emphasize as important no matter what. But the truth is that different deities and their histories and their cultures have different ways of approaching them. So I'm not going to pretend that I know everything or know the way that everyone is going to do deity work or approach a divine being. So, take this as what you will, as someone who has done deity work and now kind of mostly hangs out with spirits. But totally up to you whether or not you feel like this video is something you need, and it's totally up to you whether or not you feel like this video is going to be accurate for you in your practice. So we're going to start off with the optional first step, which is protection for deity work. So I feel like this is a topic that can be all over the place, because I think so there are like a few reasons why people say in favor of no, you don't need to protect, and of why you need, and in favor of why yes, you do need to protect. And I'm just going to break them down. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to give you both sides. So in favor of no protection for deity work is that historically speaking, that probably never would have been done. People would be calling in divine beings from their respective kind of repertoire. I think like Roman and Greek polytheism, and people visited the temples, prayed to the gods, called them in for all sorts of things all the time, and probably didn't do protection in the way we think about it. So that's kind of what people say is like, well, historically that wouldn't have been a thing. We could explore the ideas of whether or not protection was seen differently, like there were just protective measures taken, such as there were certain gods you did not worship in the home, and there were certain gods that you did A, B, and C before asking something of them. And that could maybe be seen as protection, but not in the way that we see it within witchcraft. So that would fit still under you wouldn't necessarily need to do protection spells, you would just need to look at historically, how has this deity been approached and what measures were taken before approaching them. The favor of yes protection for deity work depends. A lot of people say that if you do not protect before doing deity work, you can be approached by a trickster, like a trickster spirit or just a trickster entity, or have an entity kind of take the form of a god to play off of you. So this really depends on your belief systems. I know a lot of people who very wholeheartedly believe that tricksters can take the form of deities, and because of that, you should protect. I know a lot of other people that do not feel that tricksters can take the form of deities, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do protection. It's just a thing that you should do. It really depends on your beliefs and your practice and your culture and your traditions. For example, there are deities that you have to be initiated to talk to. And even when you seek someone out, you're like going to a person who is already initiated in a position to receive messages from that God to talk to that God. You don't approach them on your own. And in that case, that's like, that would be a close practice. We would see that as like, you need to go through the proper routes and actually get initiated before even thinking about that God. So that's an example of like, that can be considered like a protective measure, because if you're calling upon a deity or a divine being or a spirit that is within a closed practice, and you have to be initiated and there are proper ways to approach them and talk to them, and you try to talk to them or approach them or pray to them with none of that, that is what we call putting your life on the line. And I say that because the best case scenario is they ignore you because you're being disrespectful. The worst case scenario is that like that spirit decides they don't like you and that you're disrespectful and they're gonna keep you on their shit list. Which, once again, depending on the close practice and the culture, that may or may not be a thing that happens. Which is why protection for deity work is like, when we think about it, there are lots of things that can be considered protective measures or protection, or just the appropriate thing to do before approaching a divine being. And that could be seen as the protection for that God. It really depends. Personally, 2020 TikTok was a big thing where like, you have to do protection before you do deity work. You have to protect your space before you call in a divine being. I don't necessarily follow that exact mindset anymore, but also I am someone who has been working with the same goddess for like 2 years now. And when I need her, I call her. I don't necessarily cast a circle, do it in a protected space, etc. I just say a little prayer to the universe. We can also think in terms of what is deity work versus worship? Where does that line fall? Because some people, I used to argue, I know this argument because I used to be on one side and now I'm on the other. People change. One argument I used to make was that you don't need protection for worship, but you do need protection for work. But I honestly feel now as though worship and work can just be so inexplicably intertwined that I don't know if it matters. And that isn't to say that you shouldn't, look into the way that this deity was approached and how they were worshipped and consider, okay, is this a protective measure I should take in the modern day? Hello, the cat's here. So protection doesn't necessarily mean protect your space, protection spells. It could mean that you look at historically what people did to how they approached this God, or in the modern day, how is this deity or spirit or God approached in a living practice, and then consider that as a wholehearted protection measure. Not to say that if you worship a God, you're automatically working with them, or you work with a God, you're automatically worshiping them. I've worshiped plenty of deities that I didn't work with. And I think that I'm not sure, the concept of deity work, because like historically, I don't know if we've seen a lot of it, and I may be wrong, but I just think in terms of polytheistic religions historically, we don't necessarily see that a lot of working with a God. We see a lot of calling them in, which could be seen as working. We see a lot of worship, which could be seen to some people as working. But how do we define deity work versus worship? And that's something that you need to figure out as a practitioner too. I don't have an answer for you that is going to be the same for everyone. For me, personally, my worship is when I have, a space for them and I'm just kind of giving them things and not expecting anything in turn. Like I'm just showing reverence in my worship. Working is when I'm calling them in spells. I'm actively, bringing them into my life in a bigger way. I also don't necessarily call my work with Diana deity work. I call it my devotion to her. And I think that is, for me, devotion is a mix of work and worship. That's my little spiel. The other thing, My favorite thing is, does a deity need to reach out to me for me to work with them? No. No. I think that there's also a lot of debate on whether deities can reach out to you. Like a big god can reach out to you as a person to work with them. And here is my opinion. If you're seeing signs and you're feeling as though his deity is reaching out, check it out, go in that direction. Because even if, let's say, that deity is not sending you signs, you specifically, your subconscious could be seeing these things and making a connection, and that in itself could be a sign that you should work with them. I don't think that the universe needs to stop at a standstill and you need to get struck by lightning to have a deity reach out. I think that sometimes we already know who we are supposed to be working with and where we're supposed to go, and that divine being doesn't need to do anything. You're seeing the signs and making that correlation already. And that can be a deity reaching out, is you wanting to work with them, you feeling pulled to them. At the same time, that could not happen at all, and you could stumble upon a deity and be like, this is really cool, I want to worship them or work with them. Cool. You don't need things to happen to push you in that direction. If you think Pomona is really cool, she's a Roman goddess of fruit. I honestly think she's really cool. If you think Pomona is really cool and you're like, you know what? I want to start researching her and I want to work with her, even though you've never heard of her before today, you've never thought about her before, okay. You don't need a reason to go where you feel pulled. You don't need a reason to set up a shrine for an entity or a deity and be like, I'm just going to start worshiping you. You do not need lightning to strike to go somewhere. And different people have different opinions on whether or not a deity can reach out. I think personally that if you feel like a deity is reaching out, I don't think it really matters whether they're actually reaching out. It doesn't matter, because you're making those connections, you are seeing those signs, and you're feeling pulled to that deity. So done. That could be a deity reaching out. Even when reaching out, it doesn't have to be like I said, lightning strikes your house. Zeus shows up and says, I want you to work with me. And you're like, ah. For me, when I worked with Diana, my teacher at the time was like, I'm trying to work with Mary. He's like, I really just think that there's going to be a point where you only work with Diana. And I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, I think that's where you're going. And it was just him saying that. And all of a sudden, that's all I could see. I think that night, one of my dogs slept in my room, which I never did. I never had that happen. One of my dogs slept in my room. I had a full moon that was coming down, and I got my period. And I was like, well, you spoke it, and it's just time. I just knew that it was time. Based off, him saying that, me not being able to stop thinking about it, and then all of these things associated with her showing up at one time, I just knew. And then I started saying, okay, we're going with just Diana. And before, she wasn't even I had not even considered working with her before this. And I just knew. And Diana / in my practice, Diana and Mary are two sides of the same coin. Mary's always been around my family, always. Mary's always been very important to my family. And then on the flip side, Diana's always been very important to my family, way, way back. So these are things that's not going to happen for everyone, and that's okay. You don't need it to work with a deity. Researching the cultural context of deities is next on my list, and I consider this to be something that everyone should do. And part of this is the way you approach a deity, the way you work with them, the way you worship them, is entirely based on, not entirely, but primarily based on their historical documentation or the living tradition around them. And while it's perfectly fine sometimes to have your own way of approaching a deity or a deity or a divine being or spirit, it should always be respectful and take into consideration the way in which they were approached or are approached. Even when a practice is open, even when a religion is open, or it's, no longer something from antiquity. There's still a level to being respectful about the way you practice and the way you approach that deity. I use the example of, certain deities within initiatory practices having very specific ways that they were approached. That is the same with religions that no longer exist. A lot of times, the way the temples were set up, what offerings were given, are similar, or your current modern day practice can be drawn upon from that cultural context. So for example, a lot of conversations we can look at in Greek gods. A lot of the mythology around certain Greek gods is something that we see inherently as problematic because of the modern day, but in antiquity, it was normalized because of the cultural context and the society that ancient Greece was. Same with ancient Rome. There are certain things that are written that are like, ooh. For me, cultural context also means research. It's looking at the history of this deity, this divine being, and then using that to inform your practice on how to approach them. A lot of times, and I say this with love, there are a lot of deities and divine beings that were adopted or changed by Wicca and Wiccan practices. For example, the Maiden Mother Crone archetype has come to represent Hecate, Diana, plenty of other deities as well, when originally in their cultural context they were not Maiden Mother Crone. They did have 3 aspects, but those 3 aspects were not something that were akin to Maiden Mother Crone. Diana, for example, Diana Triformis, was Diana of the heavens, Diana of the earth, Diana of the underworld. Sometimes we can see Diana Triformis as also being like Diana, Selene, and Hecate, but those 3 gods together do not make up the Maiden Mother Crone. That is a newer idea and a newer concept that has been applied to a lot of different deities. The same idea is that the Celtic nations had one unified pantheon. That is kind of a newer thing, where like the Celtic astrology tree is something that was made up. I'm sorry, if you really like it, that's fine. And if you like looking at newer renditions or, reenactments of things, I understand, but at the same time, describing the Morrigan or describing the Tuatha De Danann as a Celtic pantheon isn't necessarily accurate. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about why. Because the Tuatha De Danann was specific to Ireland. And it was not necessarily a pantheon. It was a lot of different gods that there were mythos and folklore about that was informed by the people regionally and the land regionally. So there were probably also, and if there's someone who's Irish, please correct me if I'm wrong, there were also probably regional versions of these gods. And so saying it's a Celtic pantheon, one, is incorrect because it's Irish. In the same way that the Celtic pantheon has now kind of become like all of the Irish and the Welsh gods smashed together, as well as Gaulish gods, which isn't accurate because they probably were not all worshipped or even talked about in the same time or in the same regions. So it benefits you to look at historical resources. For Welsh, the Mabinogi. For the Tuatha De Danann, I think Gods and Fighting Men, the Tain, are great resources, and also learning from Irish practitioners who are working with Irish gods. There are even a few gods within that Celtic pantheon that are literally just like the spirit of Ireland. So working with that god, that deity outside of Ireland or not, it doesn't really make any sense. That's one. 2, understanding the way in which deities have kind of been changed and their information reformatted in the modern day, that to an extent really does not do them justice. It does not pull from their historical counterparts, from their mythology, from their folklore, from their primary sources. It takes their name and the idea and changes them. This isn't to say that if you work with the Maiden Mother Crone and you consider Diana to be that, or Artemis to be, and Hecate and Selene to be the Maiden Mother Crone, that's fine. But that's not something that was found in antiquity. So my problem, and I've talked about this a lot recently, my problem is always when someone says, this is something that was done by ancient people when it was not. If you are worshiping the Maiden Mother Crone, fine, that is okay. But if you say Diana has always been the maiden in Maiden Mother Crone, what's always? The last 50 years? Because historically, you found Diana at the crossroads. Trivia. She was closer akin to Hecate, and Hecate has never been a Maiden Mother Crone. She's just a triple goddess. She has 3 aspects. That triple goddess doesn't mean Maiden Mother Crone. Same with the Morrigan. The Morrigan is not the Maiden Mother Crone. The Morrigan is not even like one goddess sometimes. She's like 3, maybe 4, and has different names. So sometimes it was Badab, I can't spell, B-A-D-B. Sometimes it was Nemain. Sometimes it was the Morrigan or An Marigna. And sometimes it was, I even think there was sometimes she was on Kaliak, but I'm not sure. So she was like sometimes just 3 sisters that were referred to as An Marigna. Or sometimes An Marigna was one of those sisters. So she's never been Maiden Mother Crone. She's always been 3 sisters that fuck shit up. Or a goddess with 3 things. And Marigna was one of those things where like, when you ask, what is An Marigna? They're like, there's a lot. There could be 3 goddesses, could be 4, could be 1. You're like, okay, cool. That is why cultural context is important. Look at the way that and then that leads into altars, offerings, libations. When you're creating an altar for a deity, it doesn't have to be big. I know that like big altars are really pleasing aesthetically. I don't have an altar for one of my gods that I work with. Lupaca, the Roman she-wolf, which is called like, Lupa is the name for wolf in Italian, so Lupa literally just means wolf. So it's like the she-wolf of Rome is a deity or like a spirit I work with. I don't have an altar for her right now. And so you don't need to have an altar space, and if you have an altar space, it doesn't need to be very elaborate. My first altar, when I was erroneously worshiping deities, was just a candle for each of them with their name carved in it. You can just have a piece of jewelry you dedicate to them. You don't need a statue, you don't need an altar bowl, although you can do that. And when we talk about offerings and libations typically refer to food. Personally, most of the libations I give are to my ancestors and my spirits. I give them a lot of brandy, a lot of coffee, a lot of wine, and some snacks. I don't give Diana a lot of libations. I give her offerings like wearing devotional jewelry to her, dedicating activities to her, learning things in her honor, moving throughout my life with her in mind and how she influences my life in mind. Sometimes I'll call her in for spell work, but typically the way in which I honor her is through just living and dedicating things to her in my life. Dance, dedicated it to Diana. I also want to make her some like liquor, some Diana like liquor, maybe moonshine. I don't think I should make moonshine, but like these are things like you can do crafts, you can take a nap, you can dedicate it, but learning these things, it takes time. You don't have to start off right away with like a bunch of offerings. You could start with no offerings, you could start with a bunch of offerings. Also, to keep this in mind, everyone's experience with a deity, even if it's the same deity, is going to be different. No one's gonna have the same thing. Even when we think in terms of like the Christian God, no one has had the same experience. Someone got a burning bush, someone got an angel, someone got pregnant. No one's had the same experience, all right, with the Christian God. So with other gods, why would we have the same experience either? So saying verbatim, I know blank likes blank because of my experience with her. Someone else could have a completely different experience. And yes, it's important with that cultural context to look at, okay, historically, what was represented by this god? Did they like this? Did they like this? Like, if someone with like Dionysus, I'm sure if someone said, Dionysus is helping me get sober, I'm like, all right, god of wine, that's your experience, not my business. Other people may be like, well, he's the god of wine, you have to be bacchanalic, da-da-da. You don't have to drink the wine, you just give him the wine. Everyone's gonna have a different experience. So that's kind of part of this altar libations, is like you're not necessarily all going to have the same experience. Like, yes, historically you can see what was given as a libation to this god or altar to this god, and in living traditions, you can look at how are you supposed to approach, what offerings do they like, what is the right way to do it. So that's important. Sometimes your experience will deviate from other people's. All right, communication. So there are a couple different ways that I like to communicate with my deities. I don't necessarily go into like, and when I say communicate with deities, I don't mean like a god appears before you and starts talking to you. I mean like you say a prayer and they send you a hawk. You say a prayer or petition them and they send you a sign that it's going to work, or they do the thing. So that's one example, is prayer and petitioning deities to help you with certain things, doing, you know, hymns to them, dedicating prayers to them, literally just like verbally giving them something to help you. You can also do tarot. I really like doing communing through tarot because I will dedicate a deck to a specific entity or spirit. Then when I need to talk to them, I will use that deck to kind of confer with them. Other divinatory methods are going to vary. Let's say you work with a Norse deity. You may like the runes better than the tarot deck. Let's say you work with a Greek deity. You may want to look for traditional Greek divinatory methods. For me, since Diana is like Roman but also kind of Italian, I just go for tarocchi. Il tarocchi. Tarocchi. I go for the tarot because that's just something, like I have a Il Tarocco Soprafino, which is an Italian deck, and that's what I use. So divination is going to be different for everyone because everyone's going to have a different deity they're divining with. And typically, I really like prayer. I like petitioning. There is some evidence in an anthropology book I read that you could yell at the sky or yell at gods a little bit. And that's another thing. A lot of people say you need to be respectful of deities, but that also depends on cultural context. There are definitely deities that respect comes across a very certain way. Like, it's polite. You don't bump their altar. You don't bump their shrine. That's an example. But for me, the only thing I took out of the Aradia was everyone yelling at Diana and saying, if you don't do this, we'll curse you. And Diana said, all right, and did it. Even though it's folklore and it's not history, it's folklore, we can still look at how were these deities interacted with? How do you interact with them? I wouldn't say go around yelling at every god you meet because, once again, cultural context and tradition and beliefs. Your god may be one that you do not do that. You do not do that. For me, that's something that it's seen in like folklore and history of Diana. There's a lot of like shaking fists at the sky. That's also like, there's an Italian spell in an anthropology book I read that was literally like, go outside, yell at the sky to make sure it doesn't rain, and you like draw a circle with a scythe. So it's a lot of yelling at things, and I don't necessarily do that with Diana. I don't walk up to her statue and like scream at her and like spit at her, but sometimes all I need is like a fucking like, Diana, please help me. Like, sometimes just talk. I don't do it very frequently. I more frequently will pray the rosary and call in Diana and apparitions of Mary. But once again, how you commune with your deity is going to be different for everyone, and finding what works for you is really important. You can explore what other people do. You can kind of work through it and go from there. Finally, talking about working on a habit or creating ritual in the mundane. This for me is something that waxes and wanes. My relationship with Diana, even though she's my patron goddess, waxes and wanes with the moon. Sometimes she is very there. She's very present, she's very hands-on with me. There's very much things that I need to do with her. And sometimes she steps back a little. I know she's not gone, because she's not leaving, but right now I'm not necessarily doing a lot of workings with her. I'm working and focusing more on working with herbal allies and spirit and like saints. And it doesn't seem like she's angry about that. It's just something that's like, it's here. Also, I've noticed, at least with me, that during the times when it's more difficult for me to be outside, my relationship with Diana wanes a little bit because I find I connect with her so much in nature. For me, I still have things that I do, like I've created habits that are devoted to her, or things that I do, or I'll do like a divination, a tarot reading with her once a month, even when that relationship is waning a bit and she's not as present and I'm not doing as many things in honor of her, I still try to make time and make a habit of doing something for her. And obviously you don't need to do something every day. Sometimes I walk my dog. I'm like, this is for you, Diana. Currently, I'm forming a relationship with crossroads spirits. The Lares Competales is what they were called in Roman animism. So I'm forming a relationship with Lares Competales, and because one of Diana's epithets is Trivia, which was also one of the earlier epithets of Hecate, so it branched off from like Hecate and Diana both had Trivia. So Trivia is a goddess of the crossroads, of liminal spaces. So I can work specifically with that epithet of Diana, Trivia, as I'm working on this crossroads, working with these crossroads spirits. So there are things like I can go different ways. I also am getting a devotional piece to Diana done in February. If y'all want a vlog for that, let me know. It's also a piece that I really love, but like a devotional tattoo. If you guys want to see it, let me know. It's probably gonna go on my Instagram at some point. That is happening. And then sometimes I also want to make something for her, because I'm making Amaro bitters for my ancestors to connect with my ancestors and my ancestral herbal allies. I want to make fire cider for St. Michael and devote it to him and drink it to like bring him into my life. And then I'm trying to figure out the drink that I want to kind of like the crafter drink that I want to make for Diana to bring her into my life a little more. And this would be something that like I give them offerings of it, but I also partake in it when I want to commune with them or bring them into my life on that day. Yeah, so that is my spiel on So You Want to Work with Deities. Obviously, there's no way I could cover everything in this video. I covered the things that came to mind when I think of my own experience with deity work and the processes that I went through. And everyone has a different experience, so everyone's gonna kind of move through this journey differently, and that's okay. But it's something to kind of think about, keep in mind, work through. Is your experience with a deity may be very different from someone else's experience, and that's okay. If you have something to add, you want to tell me this video sucks, anything like that, let me know in the comments. If you want, you can subscribe, turn the bell on, but absolutely no pressure. I do want to say that we are reading a really great book club in Patreon this month, and I have a workshop, many workshops, that I think I'm going to be doing a Diana intensive soon, so you can go down to my Patreon and join for the $12 tier and get access to both book club and all of my workshops. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to drink water and have an amazing rest of your day. Siate benedetti.